I remember the way the cold felt against my cheeks that evening in Boston, the kind of sharp December air that makes your breath look like thin white smoke. My name is Grace Hollander, and I was 32 that winter. I had spent the whole day convincing myself that Christmas dinner might finally be the night my family softened toward me. I kept telling myself that families fight and families heal, and maybe this would be the start of ours finding its way back. If you are listening right now, I would honestly love to know what you are doing while you hear this. For me, I was driving through Beacon Hill with a homemade pie on the seat beside me and the snow coming down in soft sheets when everything began to unravel. The streets were already glowing with Christmas lights, wreaths on brownstone doors, cars double parked, a man in a red scarf walking his dog. It should have been comforting. Instead, I felt a tightness in my stomach I could not shake. I had grown up only a few blocks from where I was driving. Every street in this neighborhood held some memory from my childhood. Christmases. My dad laughed with a tumbler of bourbon. My mom in a sequin sweater setting out serving dishes. My older sister Savannah singing carols off-key even though she had this strange confidence about her voice. And me trying to fit in somewhere among all of them. I parked at the far corner of the block because every spot near the house was taken. I remember thinking that meant a full table this year. More family, more friends, more warmth. I carried the pie I had baked that morning, and the bottle of Cabernet that one of my clients had gifted me. I took my time walking toward the house. I had styled my hair the way my mom always preferred. I had worn the wool coat she once bought for me at a winter sale in Back Bay. Even then, I wanted to believe there was still room for me in this picture of holiday perfection. As I stepped onto the stone walkway leading to the front door, I saw something that made my breath catch. Through the narrow glass panels, I saw movement in the dining room. A table set with our family china. Candles lit. People are already seated. Savannah was standing near the chair at the end of the table where I usually, Saturday. And next to her, someone else. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. My best friend, Lily, the person I had trusted more than anyone outside of my family. She was seated at my place and laughing at something Savannah had whispered to her. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling that hit me at that moment. I rang the doorbell and waited. The laughter inside grew quiet. Footsteps approached. The door opened slowly, and my dad appeared. He looked polished as always. Navy sweater, crisp shirt, a kind of stiff elegance that made him seem taller than he actually was. Behind him, the warm glow of the dining room spilled into the hallway. I smiled and said hi in the softest voice, because something about his expression already felt wrong. My dad stepped forward and blocked the doorway with his arm. He did not greet me. He did not even glance at the pie or the bottle of wine. He looked at me like I was someone he barely recognized, and he told me that I was not invited tonight, and that I should go home. I felt something in me crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, more like the quiet snap of something that had been strained too long. Behind my dad, I saw Savannah tilt her head and give a small, satisfied smile. Lily kept her eyes down, but the corners of her mouth were lifted in a way I had never seen before. My mom was at the far end of the hall, pretending to adjust a table runner. Anyone could tell she had been avoiding eye contact long before I arrived. My dad shifted slightly as if ready to close the door. He said it would be better for everyone if I just left. His voice was calm. Too calm. I stood there holding that pie with both hands while the cold edged deeper into my coat. I wanted to think it was a misunderstanding. I wanted to ask why, but something in his eyes told me that this had been planned. This was not a last-minute decision. This was arranged. A new flash of movement caught my eye. Lily leaned closer to Savannah and whispered something. Savannah gave a soft laugh. It was not loud or cruel, but it cut just the same. I saw then that they thought they had won some private battle that I had not even known I was fighting. I realized that if I said anything at all, I would break. So I simply nodded. I told my dad I understood. I turned away before the weight in my chest crushed me right there on the front steps. The snow had picked up by the time I reached the sidewalk. My breath was shaking. I kept my eyes on the car because if I looked back at that house, I knew I would fall apart. Once inside, I set the pie on the passenger seat. My hands were trembling so hard, the box nearly slid off. For a long moment, I just sat there, listening to the quiet, thinking about how all those years I had believed that if I worked hard enough, stayed kind enough, proved myself enough, I would earn my place in that family. But standing at that door showed me the truth. They had decided long before tonight that there was no room for me at that table. When the tears finally fell, they fell fast. Not from sadness alone, but from something colder and sharper, a kind of betrayal that lives in your bones. I wiped my face with my sleeve and took a deep breath. That breath changed everything. I reached for my phone. My fingers hesitated only for a second before I found the number I had saved. Months earlier. Detective Mark Briggs from the Financial Crimes Unit. I had met him once when I first questioned some strange patterns inside Hollander and Avery Investments, the firm my dad owned. At that time, I still wanted to believe I was mistaken. I still wanted to protect my family. But after being turned away at my own family Christmas dinner, I felt something inside me settle into place. When Briggs answered, I could hear quiet voices in the background, like he was, still at the office, even on Christmas Eve. I told him my name. I told him I was ready to hand over everything I had collected. I told him that my dad was running a fraud that hurt people, including elderly clients who trusted him. My voice did not shake once. Briggs took a moment before speaking. He said that his team had been waiting for my call. He told me not to leave town tonight, and that they would move before sunrise. His words felt heavy and real. My whole body went still. I ended the call and set the phone down in my lap. Outside, the snow kept falling across the windshield in thin, white lines. Inside the car, I felt a strange quiet settle over me. I knew there was no turning back now. I watched the warm lights of my childhood home flicker in the distance through the falling snow. Then I turned the key in the ignition and drove away. And that was the night everything changed. The rest long before the sun came up. But in that dark car outside my parents' house, my mind went somewhere else. First, it went backward to the first time I realized something was off inside Hollander Avery. Investment long before I even knew there was a detective whose number I should keep in my day. Phone. Almost a year earlier, I was still sitting behind my glass-walled desk on the 12th floor of our office building in downtown Boston. Back then, I was still the good daughter who worked in the family firm, still the one trying to bridge the gap between my dad's old-school ways and this modern clients we were courting. I handled marketing and client relationships, the smiling face, the one who could translate confusing financial language into something our clients could actually understand. On that particular afternoon, I remember staring at a printed statement for one of our longtime clients, a retired teacher named Helen Mason. It was supposed to be a simple year-end review packet, the kind of thing we sent out every December. I had helped design the layout, so I knew where every number should sit on the page. But something about hers made my skin prickle. The numbers were neat, confident, like they were trying too hard to look normal. Her account balance had dipped far more than it should have, given the way her BIM portfolio was supposedly set up. I knew because I had sat with her 2 years earlier, listened while she talked about how she could not afford to lose more than a small portion of her savings. She had joked that she was too old to start over, and that every dollar of that account was a year of her life spent on her feet in a classroom. I pulled up her digital file and clicked through old notes. Conservative risk tolerance. Emphasis on capital preservation. I remembered the way she had squeezed my hand when she left that meeting. She told me that she trusted me, that she trusted my dad because I trusted him. Then my stomach dropped. There it was, a line on a screen that did not make sense, a withdrawal that had no note next to it. Another one a few months later, both labeled as internal transfers. On paper, it could have been routine. In my gut, it felt wrong. I told myself it was probably a clerical thing, a typo, a simple explanation. That was the first lie I told myself in this story. A week later, Helen showed up at the office in person. She walked in without an appointment, cheeks pink from the wind, gloved hands clutched around her purse strap. She asked if she could speak to me privately. We sat in one of the small conference rooms with the glass door. She told me that she had tried not to bother me, that she knew it was a busy time of year. but something was keeping her up at night. Her monthly check had been smaller than she expected. She had called the general office line, and someone had brushed her off and told her that markets go up and down. Her voice shook when she said that she could accept market swings, but she could not understand why it felt like money was simply disappearing. She handed me crumpled copies of letters she had received, all printed with our logo, all full of reassuring language. When I lined them up on the table, my chest tightened. The returns listed there were too steady to be real for the mix of investments she supposedly held. It was the kind of smooth line that only exists in PowerPoint slides, not in actual markets. I promised her I would look into it. Even now, I can feel how heavy that promise was on my tongue. Later that afternoon, I walked into my dad's office with the file in my hands. His office smelled like leather and old books, and the faint bite of his favorite cologne. He was at his desk going through papers when I told him I had some questions about a few client statements, including Miss Mason. I tried to keep my voice steady and professional. He did not look at the papers for more than a few seconds. He told me that these kinds of details were above my pay grade, that what I was seeing were simply internal reallocations and temporary measure. He said that nothing was wrong. He reminded me that my job was to build relationships and tell our story, not to second-guess the people who manage the money. Something in the way he said those words made me feel smaller than I had felt in a long time. I walked out of his office with the file still in my hands and a dull pounding in the back of my head. I wanted to believe him. He was my dad. He had built the company from nothing. He had always been the one who knew what to do. Over the next few weeks, though, I started seeing similar patterns on other accounts. Not technical details, just simple things that anyone paying attention would notice. Balances that shifted in ways that did not match the stories we were telling our clients. Performance that never dipped when the rest of the market did. Notes that had clearly been added long after the fact. I began to keep copies. Nothing dramatic, just printed statements and a few screenshots saved in a personal folder. Small acts of self-protection. I was not even fully admitting to myself. Around that time, my sister Savannah started popping her head into my office more often. She had always been the golden child. Business school, perfect grades, natural charm in front of a boardroom. She had slid into a leadership role at the firm as if the seat had been waiting for her all along. For years, I had tried not to compare myself to her. That winter, it became impossible not to. One evening, she leaned against my doorframe while I was reviewing yet another packet of client letters. She joked that I was staying late so often that I might as well move a cot into my office. When I did not laugh, she came in and sat across from me. She asked what was going on in that too sweet tone she used when she was fishing for information. I told her I had been getting more calls from older clients. People like Helen, people confused about their balances. I said I just wanted to be sure everything was as it should be. She gave me a long look, then said that I was worrying too much. She said that our dad knew exactly what he was doing, that I needed to trust the process, that talking too much about internal matters could make things harder for everyone. She used the word loyal more than once. When she left my office, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows. The piece that finally snapped something open in my mind did not come from a client file. It came from me. My trust fund had always been this abstract concept my grandparents had set up, something I was told not to touch until I was older. I had never really bothered to look at it closely. One night, almost on a whim, I logged into the portal to check the balance. I had a rough idea of what should have been there. The number on the screen was smaller. Not dramatically. Just enough that my breath caught. I looked at the transaction history and saw 3 withdrawals spaced out over the previous 2 years, each labeled with bland phrases, each supposedly authorized by me. My hands went cold on the keyboard. I did not remember signing anything. I did not remember any conversation about using that money for anything. The next day, I asked our operations manager to pull whatever physical paperwork existed for my trust. She gave me a careful look, but did as I asked. When I opened the file, there were forms with my signature on them. My name, my writing. Except it was not. The curve of the letters was just a little too stiff, the slant not quite right. It looked like someone had practiced. I went to see HR. Linda Cho had been with the firm long before I joined. She had this quiet way of telling you more with her eyes than with her words. I closed her door and told her that I thought something was wrong with my accounts. I showed her copies of a few things, not everything, just enough. She listened, then folded her hands and told me to be careful. She said that in families like mine, lines between what belonged to the business and what belonged to individual members could get blurred. She said she had seen people get pushed out before when they asked too many questions. The way she said it told me she was not just talking in general terms. Walking back to my office that day, the carpet felt softer under my feet, and the walls of glass felt thinner. For the first time, I wondered if those walls were there to make us look transparent to the outside world, while hiding everything that really mattered, just out of sight. I sat down, stared at my reflection in the dark computer screen, and realized that I had to decide how far I was willing to go and how much I was willing to lose to find out the truth. That was the moment I picked up my phone and called the one person I believed would never lie to me. Lily, my closest friend for more than a decade, the woman who had been there through my breakups, my mom's health scares, my first apartment, every birthday, every promotion, every disappointment. If anyone could help me make sense of what was happening inside Hollander, Avery Investments, it was her. She answered on the second ring. She always did it with me. Her voice was warm, familiar, wrapped in the same easy confidence she had always carried. She asked what was wrong because she could hear it in my breathing before I even said a word. I told her I needed to talk and asked if she could meet at a coffee shop near Copley Square. She agreed right away. No questions, no hesitation. I remember feeling grateful in a way that almost hurt. When I got there, she was already seated by the window with her coat draped neatly over the back of her chair. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that had always felt like home. I slid into the seat across from her, wrapped my hands around the warm cup, and tried to find the courage to tell her what I had found. I started with Helen, then the strange statements, the trust fund withdrawals. I told her that something was deeply wrong and that I was scared. Not scared for myself exactly, but scared for the clients who had trusted us. Scared that I might be the only one willing to ask the questions no one wanted to answer. Her expression shifted in a way I did not understand at the time. Soft, then tight, then something like resignation, before she forced her face back into a calm mask. She told me that I should not jump to conclusions. She told me that sometimes people misread their own accounts. She told me that I might be making myself anxious over nothing. That stung, not because I expected complete agreement from her, but because it did not feel like the Lily I knew. She had always been the one who urged me to trust my instincts. She had never dismissed my worries before. I told her that the numbers did not lie. She took a slow breath and said that if I kept digging into internal matters, I might put myself at risk. She said that she cared about me and did not want to see me make a mistake. Something in her tone made my pulse slow. It was too careful, too measured. I asked her if she had noticed anything strange in the firm. She looked out the window instead of at me and said that she stayed in her lane and did her job. She said that was how she survived in a place like ours. When we stood to leave, she hugged me, but the way she held me felt different, too loose, too quick, as if she was already somewhere else in her mind. I walked away, reminding myself that stress can make anyone act strangely. I wanted to believe that nothing between us had changed. A few days later, I learned just how wrong I was. It was early afternoon, and I had just returned from a client lunch when I passed a conversation happening in the hallway outside the executive offices. I did not mean to listen. I only paused because I heard my own name. Lily was speaking quietly with my dad. I recognized her voice, even though her tone had dropped into something low and professional. I heard her say that she had done everything he asked, that she had redirected a few accounts, that she had kept me focused on clients instead of the internal numbers. Then she said that she hoped the position they had discussed was still guaranteed. My dad's voice was harder to read, but I heard him say that loyalty was always rewarded, especially at the senior level. He told her that the chief financial officer seat required someone who understood how to protect the company. someone who did not panic, someone who knew how to keep things tidy. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. I stepped backwards so quickly that my heel hit the wall. They did not see me. I waited until the hallway was empty, then walked to the restroom and locked myself into a stall. My whole body shook as I tried to breathe. Lily, my closest friend, had been meeting with my dad behind my back. She had been feeding him information about me. She had been helping him keep me away from anything that might raise suspicion. And in return, he was offering her power, a title, a promotion. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I pressed my hand against my mouth and tried to steady the rising panic. Over the next week, I began noticing more signs that should have been obvious sooner. Lily stopped dropping by my office the way she used to. Savannah suddenly had access to client accounts I once handled. Meetings I had always been included in were suddenly happening without me. And when I did attend the ones I was invited to, there was always an empty chair between me and the rest of them, as if I had become someone they needed distance from. It was the kind of slow erasure you only notice after it has already taken root. Then came the moment I will never forget. I checked on a client account I had managed for years, an older man named Robert Lang. His portfolio had always been modest but stable. That afternoon, his entire balance was significantly lower than it should have been. Not just by a little, by enough that any rational person would be terrified. I printed the file and walked into the operations office. The woman behind the desk gave me a nervous look and said that certain accounts had been reassigned to new team members. I asked who. She hesitated. Then she whispered that they had been transferred to Lily. My breath left my lungs in one long exhale. For the first time in my life, betrayal had a face, and it was hers. I left the building early that day. The January air was biting cold, even though the sun was out. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I had the strangest sensation that someone was watching me from an office, the window above. I did not look up because I already knew what I would see. My dad. Maybe Savannah. Maybe both. I walked until the pressure behind my ribs eased. I walked until the questions in my head quieted. And then I stopped on a bench near the Charles River and stared at the frozen water. I had always believed that the worst thing a family could do was disappoint you. Now I understood there were worse things. They could recruit the people you loved. They could turn your loyalty into a weakness. They could make you doubt your own sanity until you felt like a stranger in yourself, your own life. That evening, when I unlocked my apartment and turned on the lights, I felt something cold settle inside me. A certainty, a quiet decision that nothing would be the same from here on out. For the first time, I looked at them not as loose threads, but as pieces of a pattern I could no longer ignore. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the notes and screenshots spread out in front of me. For weeks, they had been nothing more than scattered pieces of fear, things I collected without letting myself believe what they meant. That night, under the soft hum of my refrigerator and the distant traffic on quote-unquote Massachusetts Avenue, they finally became something else. They became evidence. I picked up the first stack, a set of statements from clients I had worked with since my early 20s. I ran my thumb over the dates. Every one of them showed a pattern that did not belong in legitimate investing. Balances that dipped in quiet little steps, withdrawals labeled as internal transfers, but with no clear reason, returns that stayed smooth when the market had been anything but smooth. Even to someone with basic financial knowledge, it was the kind of thing that made the back of your neck heat up. I took a deep breath and kept going. There were emails, too, printable copies of short exchanges between my dad, Savannah, and a few senior associates. They always used careful language. Always kept everything vague. But if you looked long enough, you noticed how often they referenced timing and optics, and how certain clients needed to be kept reassured until the next quarter. There was never a direct line that said something illegal was happening, but there was a tone that suggested something being smoothed over instead of something being managed. Then there were the messages from clients themselves. I had saved some of them without thinking. Notes from people who trusted us, people like Helen Mason. They asked small questions at first, gentle questions. Things like why their statement seemed lighter, or why their last check was short. Reading them again with new eyes made my throat tighten. These people were not complaining. They were scared. They just did not know how to say it. I made myself stand up and refill my water because my hands were shaking. When I came back to the table, I sat down and pulled the folder closer. My trust fund papers were next. I laid them out one by one. These forms I supposedly signed. Seeing them in a straight line made it obvious. The handwriting was close, but not mine. The slant leaned the wrong direction. The loops were too sharp. Someone had practiced. Someone had practiced on my name. I leaned back and let out a slow breath. I pressed my palms over my eyes and stayed that way for a long time. I kept replaying conversations in my head. My dad brushed me aside. Savannah told me to stay loyal. Lily told me not to panic. I tried to figure out when each of them had decided that I did not need the truth. I tried to remember the exact moment I went from daughter and sister and friend to someone they needed to keep out of the way. I picked up my pen and started writing down everything I knew in plain language. No details that would confuse me later. Just the truth as clearly as I could put it. Clients losing money they could not afford to lose. Numbers adjusted after the fact. A year and a half of transactions on my trust fund without my knowledge. Lily gained access to accounts that were never hers. My role slowly shrunk until I was barely allowed to speak with anyone. I wrote until my hand cramped. At some point, I realized the fear I had carried for weeks was still there, but had changed shape. It was no longer a sharp panic. It was quiet and controlled, and sat low in my chest like a stone. It gave me focus. I turned off the main light so the room was dim and left only the small lamp on the counter. The apartment felt safer that way, less exposed. I stood at the window and looked down at the street. The sidewalks were empty. Snow lined both sides of the curb. The air outside was cold enough to make the windows sweat at the edges. My phone buzzed against the table. A message from Savannah. It was short. A simple reminder about an upcoming team meeting I had not been invited to. The timing was strange, almost like she wanted to check whether I was still playing along. I set the phone face down. There was no going back now. The next morning, I carried the folder to my office in a tote bag pressed against my side. I did not want to leave it at home. I did not want to leave it anywhere. When I reached the building lobby, the security guard gave me a polite nod, but his eyes lingered on me longer than usual. I did not know if that meant anything, but my stomach tightened all the same. On the 12th floor, everything looked normal. Too normal. People chatting near the coffee maker, phones ringing, laptops open. It all felt staged to me. Like a picture of an office instead of an actual one. I stepped into my office, closed the door quietly, and lowered the blinds, even though they were hardly ever closed. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The folder went on the corner of the desk with my hand resting on top of it as if my touch alone could protect it. For the first hour, I pretended to work. I answered emails that did not matter. I reviewed a draft of a quarterly letter. I forced myself to act like the Grace everyone expected, the one who smiled and worked hard and kept the peace. Around late morning, there was a soft knock. I felt a jolt shoot up my spine. I said, "Come in," and tried to keep my voice steady. It was not my dad. It was not Savannah. It was not Lily. It was Helen Mason. She stepped inside with her coat still on, her gloves in her hands, and her purse strap looped around her wrist. She looked smaller than I remembered, like winter had pressed down on her bones. She said she hoped she was not interrupting, but she had been worrying about her account again. She said she trusted me, and only me. She said she had found another letter that did not match the others and thought she should show it to me. I asked her to sit. My voice trembled a little, but she did not seem to notice. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter that looked almost identical to the others, except for one thing. The returns listed there were impossible. They were numbers pasted together to look consistent. Numbers that would reassure someone who needed reassurance more than anything else. Helen watched my face as I read it. I wanted to tell her everything at that moment. I wanted to tell her what I had seen in the files, what I suspected, what I feared. But I could not yet. Not without something official. Not without someone who could protect her. And protect me. I told her gently that I would take care of it. She squeezed my hand and thanked me with this look that went straight through me. Trust, hope, fear, all mixed together. After she left, I closed my office door again and locked it. For the first time, I allowed myself to say the quiet truth out loud, not loudly, not dramatically, just in a whisper that landed on the still air of my office. My dad is stealing from people. The words sat between me and the window glass like a living thing. I opened my laptop and looked at the contact information I had once written down but never used. Detective Mark Briggs, Financial Crimes Unit. I stared at his number for a long time. I knew calling him would change everything. I knew not calling him would break me. I knew I was standing at the edge of something that would not let me stay there. Same. I sat there with my phone in my hand and the number on the screen for a long time. Detective Mark Briggs. I had met him at a compliance seminar nearly a year before, one of those dull breakfast events at a downtown hotel where the coffee is weak and the pastries all taste the same. I remembered how he had spoken about financial crimes in a way that did not sound abstract at all. He talked about people, about retired nurses and widows and small business owners who had trusted the wrong firms. At the time, I had felt a strange flutter in my chest listening to him, like something in my world had shifted half an inch. After his talk, I went up, thanked him, and asked a vague question about how someone inside a firm might raise concerns. He had handed me his card and told me quietly that if I ever saw something that did not sit right in my gut, I should not ignore it. Then I tucked his card into my wallet and did exactly that. I ignored it. Now his name glowed in my contacts list, and my thumb hovered over the call button. I could almost hear his voice from that hotel ballroom, steady and firm, saying that silence is the soil where certain crimes grow best. But this was still before Christmas, before the front door and the pie and the humiliation, before my last illusion about my family had been ripped away. I did not call him that day. Instead, I locked the office door, slid his name back into my pocket, and told myself I just needed a little more time. A little more proof, a little more courage. The days after that blurred together in a way that only December in a busy city can. Twinkle lights on every street, office parties, end-of-year reports, the constant hum of cheer that felt louder the more alone I felt. I went through the motions at work, nodding in meetings I had no real say in anymore, answering calls from clients with a tone I no longer believed. At home, I found myself doing something that surprised me. I started decorating. I had never been the type to get carried away with Christmas, probably because my mom's version of it had always been so intense and controlled, like a performance for the neighbors and my dad's business contacts. But that year, in my small Cambridge apartment, I put up a little artificial tree and strung white lights around the window. I baked cookies, just for myself. I put on an old record of carols my grandmother used to play. It was as if some part of me was trying to prove I could build warmth in a place that had nothing to do with the Hollander name. 3 days before Christmas, my phone buzzed with a message from my mom. It was brief. She told me Christmas dinner would be at 7 in the evening at the house, and that I should keep my outfit simple. There was no heart emoji, no I miss you, no suggestion of sharing recipes like we used to, just information, clipped and cool. I stared at that text far longer than it deserved. The old part of me, the little girl who had once stood on a chair in our kitchen to help my mom, frost cookies, lit up with hope. An invitation meant inclusion. It meant there was still a place for me at that table. Maybe my dad had calmed down. Maybe Savannah had let go of whatever resentment she was holding. Maybe Lily had come to her senses. The rational part of me knew better. But it is hard to kill that child who still wants her mom to look at her and see something worth loving. The next day at the office, I tried to focus on small tasks. My mind kept drifting. Around mid-afternoon, I saw an internal calendar notification pop up on my screen for a strategy meeting I had not been invited to attend. I almost clicked to delete it, but something made me click the tiny details button instead. The attendee list made my chest tighten. My dad, Savannah, 2 outside attorneys, and Lily. No one from my department. No one from compliance. The meeting's subject line was simply noted as year-end restructuring and scheduled for the morning of December 26th. I forwarded the notice to my personal email without thinking, then shut my laptop harder than I needed to. My eyes burned. I told a discussion about new roles, but deep down, I knew exactly what kind of conversation happens with attorneys. 2 days after Christmas, in a firm that smells like secrets. On my way out of the building, I passed my dad's office. His door was cracked just enough that I could hear his voice. He was things about winding down certain accounts before the new year and making sure. Nothing looked rushed on paper. Then Savannah spoke about messaging, how clients needed calm and simple language. My name did not come up, not once. It was as if I did not exist anymore inside the world they were plotting. That night, I sat on my couch with the lights on my little tree glowing softly and the folder of evidence resting in my lap. I could feel my heart beating against it through the blanket. I thought of Helen, of her trembling hands, and the way she had looked at me for reassurance. I thought of my trust fund and my forged signature. I thought of Lily sitting in some meeting room laughing at a joke from my dad, the two of them deciding what parts of the story I was allowed to see. I opened my laptop and searched for my dad's name on public databases, just to see what the outside world saw. Awards, charity involvement, articles praising his firm for stability during volatile markets, pictures of him shaking hands with local politicians and speaking on panels about ethics in finance. Ethics. I had to close the laptop to keep from throwing it across the room. The day before Christmas Eve, I went into the office, mostly because I did not know what else to do with myself. It was quiet. Half the staff had taken vacation days. Even the coffee smelled tired. Linda from HR walked by my open door and hesitated. Then she stepped in and asked if I had a minute. She closed the door behind her and sat down. She told me, in that careful way of hers, that she had heard bits and pieces of conversations that made her uneasy. She did not know detail, but she knew enough about how things go wrong in family firms to recognize them. She said that it looked like some kind of ownership shift was being prepared, one that might move both assets and control into fewer hands. Fewer people to question. Fewer people to share blame if something broke. I could feel my throat closing. I asked her if my job was safe. She hesitated. Then she said she could not promise anything. Not in a situation like this. She told me again to be careful. She said that sometimes protecting yourself meant having someone outside the family who knew the truth. When she left my office, I did not sit back down. I walked to the ladies' room, stared at myself in the mirror above the sink, and barely recognized the woman looking back. There was a tightness around my mouth I had not seen before, a hardness in my eyes that felt both foreign and deeply earned. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, a new email came in on my personal account. It was from a junior associate who sometimes forwarded me things he thought I should see when I was quietly being pushed out of the loop. He wrote only a few words telling me that I might want to read the attached draft. It was a proposed internal memo dated for the week after Christmas. It laid out a plan for reassuring clients after a transition in leadership. The language was smooth and dry, but between the lines, it said something very loud. It implied that my dad was preparing to step back from public view, while still directing things from behind the scenes. It also suggested that certain team members, specifically those in marketing and client relations, who might cause confusion, would be repositioned. Near the bottom of the document, my name appeared in a single short sentence. It said that I had decided to pursue new opportunities and would no longer be involved in client communication after the new year. No one had told me that. It was my life on a page, rewritten without my consent. I read that line over and over until the words blurred. Then I scrolled down and saw the initials at the bottom of the draft, indicator who had reviewed it. My dad's, Savannah's, and Lily's. I sat there in the half-lit glow of my bedroom, laptop burning warm on my knees, and something inside me went very still. It was the kind of stillness that comes when there are no more excuses left to make for anyone. Outside my window, I could hear someone down the street laughing, probably coming home from a holiday party. Somewhere across the river, families were wrapping presents and arguing over recipes and yelling at kids to come help with the tree. Normal sounds. Ordinary lives. The kind of messy holiday chaos I used to dream about when ours was too. Perfect and polished. In my little apartment, the only sound was my own heartbeat and the faint hum of the heating unit. Christmas dinner was less than 48 hours away. The invitation from my mom was still sitting unanswered in my messages. For the first time, I understood it for what it probably was. Not an olive branch, not a gesture of reconciliation, a stage. An event where my absence or my presence would both serve some purpose in. There, in the dark, lying flat on my back, I stared at the ceiling and counted my breaths. I knew that something was going to break at that dinner, whether I walked through that door smiling or whether I stayed away. And I knew, finally and fully, that when it did break, I was not going to pretend it was an accident. The night ended with that thought sitting heavy in my chest, and when I finally slept, it was shallow and restless. I woke on Christmas Eve with the gray light leaking around the blinds and the room cold in that particular way old New England apartments always are in. December. For a few seconds, I did not remember what day it was. Then my stomach reminded me. Christmas dinner. I lay there listening to the radiator ticking and the muted sounds of someone shoveling outside. Part of me wanted to text my mom and say I was sick, that I could not make it. Another part of me knew that avoiding the evening would not stop anything. Whatever they were planning inside the company was already in motion, with or without me sitting at that table. The only thing still in my control was how honest I was willing to be with myself about who these people really were. I got up because doing nothing felt worse than moving. I made coffee and burned my tongue on the first sip because my hands were not as steady as I pretended. I pulled flour and sugar from the cabinet and started a pie crust, more out of habit than enthusiasm. My dad liked pecan pie. My mom always said it was the only dessert he actually enjoyed. I had baked it for his birthdays and for at least 10 Christmas dinners. The motions were muscle memory now, even if my heart was no longer in it. As I measured and stirred, I caught myself thinking about my mom more than my dad, about her hands moving fast in our kitchen when I was a girl, about the way she could transform a plain room into something that looked like a photograph in a magazine. She had always been more concerned with how things looked than how they felt, but there had been little moments when I thought I saw the woman she might have been if she had not tied her whole identity to my dad's reputation. I wondered which version of her I would face that night. The polished hostess who pretended everything was fine, or the woman who had to know, deep down, that the life she was guarding was built on something rotten. By late afternoon, the pie was cooling on the counter and my little apartment smelled like brown sugar and toasted nuts. I stood in front of my closet longer than I should have, staring at hangers as if they were multiple choice answers on a test I had no chance of passing. In the end, I picked a simple green sweater dress and thick tights. Something conservative, but still me. I put on the gold earrings my grandmother had left me and pulled my hair back. The way my mom used to say, framed my face nicely. The sky was already starting to darken when I carried the pie out to my car. Snowflakes drifted down in slow, lazy spirals. The streets were quieter than usual. Most people already tucked into their homes, cooking and arguing and doing all the messy things families do. The drive into Boston from Cambridge felt shorter than usual. Maybe because my mind was not on traffic. It was back in that conference room with Helen, in my office with Linda, outside my dad's door hearing my own name vanish from their plans. Every red light gave me one more chance to turn around. I did not. When I turned onto the street where the house sat, the sight made me clamp my jaw. Every parking spot in front of our brownstone was taken. A line of familiar cars hugged the curb. Business partners, old friends, people who thought they knew my dad, people who would defend him with phrases like solid and trustworthy because they had only ever seen the version of him my mom had polished for public view. I parked half a block away and sat in the idling car for a minute, staring at the lights glowing from the tall windows. From that distance, the house looked like something on a postcard. Wreath on the front door, candles in every window, a soft, golden glow spilling onto the snow. I picked up the pie from the passenger seat, took a breath that felt like it scraped my ribs, and stepped out into the cold. My boots crunched on the salted walkway. The closer I got, the more clearly I could hear muffled sounds from inside. A burst of laughter, the faint clink of glass, someone calling out for more ice. It was the soundtrack of a life I had spent years trying to belong to. At the front steps, I paused and adjusted my grip on the pie. I could see through the narrow glass panes on either side of the door, but only in fragments. A flash of Savannah's blonde hair as she moved past the dining room archway. My mom's hand smoothing a napkin, the glint of her bracelet under the chandelier. A profile that looked like Lily, seated, head tilted back in a laugh. My throat tightened. I pressed the doorbell before I could talk myself out of it. The sounds inside shifted. The laughter dimmed, as if someone had lowered a volume knob. Footsteps approached. For a second, I imagined my mom opening the door, pulling me into a hug, pretending none of the past year had happened. I imagined her whispering that we would talk later, that we would figure things out privately. Even then, a part of me still wanted that story. The door opened only a crack at first, then wider. It was my dad. He filled the doorway in that way he always had, even when I was a kid, and smaller than the coats hanging behind him. His hair was neatly combed, his sweater perfectly pressed. Only his eyes gave anything away. They were flat. No surprise, no warmth, just calculation. He did not move aside. He did not look at the pie or at the snow on my shoulders. He looked directly at me and told me in an even voice that I should not have come. That Christmas dinner tonight was not for me, that it would be better if I went back to my place and left this evening too. The family members and guests who knew how to support what the family needed. Behind him, I saw Savannah. She was standing near the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. My chair. Except it was not empty. Lily was sitting there, wearing a dress I had once helped her pick out for a different party in a different year when I still thought she was on my side. She glanced at me, then away, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to be seen. Savannah leaned down and said something into her ear. I could not make out the word, but I could read the intent in the way they both almost smiled. It was the expression of people who believed a problem had finally been solved. My mom stood at the far end of the room, near the sideboard. She busied herself with straightening silverware that did not need straightening. I saw her shoulders tighten, but she never looked up. Not once. In that little pocket of silence on the doorstep, time stretched. I could feel the cold seeping through the soles of my boots. I could hear faint clinks of plates in the background as someone in the kitchen kept working through the awkward pause. Somewhere in the living room, a Christmas record kept playing, the singer crooning about peace and joy, while my dad held the doorframe as if he were guarding a vault. I realized then that this was not a moment of emotion for him. This was an operation. I was a variable he wanted removed. Everything in me wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation, to remind him of every year I had sat at that table, of every event I had attended for the firm, of every time I had defended his name to people who doubted him. But I knew exactly what he would do with those words. He would twist them into a narrative about me being too dramatic, too unstable, too ungrateful. So I did something that surprised even me. I did not argue. I shifted the pie in my hands until the cardboard edge dug into my palms. I nodded once, a small motion that felt like swallowing glass, and I said I understood. My voice sounded calm to my own ears, detached, as if I were agreeing to leave a meeting early, not stepping away from my entire family. My dad gave a curt little nod in return. He told me to drive safely, as if we were discussing the weather. As if he had not just erased me from his life in front of a room full of people. I turned and walked down the steps. I did not look back into the dining room, but I could feel eyes on my back. Some are curious, some are uncomfortable. A few, I suspected, quietly pleased. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the cold air burned my lungs. I kept my head down until I reached my car. Once inside, I set the pie on the passenger seat with more force than I meant. 2. And the box slid a few inches. My hands were numb. I did not know if it was from the temperature or from what had just happened. I sat there with the engine off, the house still visible in the rearview mirror. Through the front windows, I could see movement again, the party stitching itself back together as if nothing had happened. Someone closed the curtains halfway, blocking the view. The first tear that slipped down my cheek surprised me. Then more followed. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw little bursts of color. It was not just pain. It was humiliating. It was the raw sting of being told in the clearest way possible that you are no longer part of your own story. When the tears stopped, what settled in their place was not emptiness. It was a kind of clarity I had never felt before. I reached for my phone with fingers that no longer shook. I scrolled to the contact I had stared at in my office days earlier, Detective Mark Briggs. The folder with my copies and notes and printed statements was in the back seat, tucked under a blanket, because some part of me must have known I might need it tonight. I hit the call button and lifted the phone to my ear. He answered on the third ring, his voice steady, even with the faint noise of people talking somewhere behind. Him. Probably other officers still on duty on Christmas Eve. I told him my name. I told him that the things we had talked about months ago inside a dull hotel ballroom were not hypothetical anymore. I told him I was ready to give him everything I had collected. He was quiet for a moment, in that way that says more than any rushed words. Then he told me his team had been following threads connected to my dad's firm for some time. My information, he said, could be the missing piece. He asked if I could come in that night, that very night, before morning. He said that if what I had was as serious as it sounded, they had no reason to wait. I agreed before I could second-guess myself. I ended the call, put the car in gear, and pulled away from the curb. In the mirror, the house where I had grown up grew smaller, its windows glowing in the falling snow. For the first time in my life, I drove through Boston on Christmas Eve, knowing I was no longer just the daughter of the man in that house. I was the person who was going to help bring his world down. I drove through the quiet Christmas Eve streets with my hands tight on the steering wheel, the folder rustling softly in the back seat every time I turned. The city was half asleep, wrapped in snow and blinking with lights. I passed restaurants closing early, couples walking arm in arm, families carrying leftover boxes of dessert. It felt like I was moving through a world that no longer had anything to do with me. I had crossed some invisible line the moment I pressed that call button. The police station sat near the river, a stone building with narrow windows that reflected the streetlights. I parked in a visitor spot and grabbed the folder, clutching it to my chest as the cold bit into my skin. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me first. Then the stillness. It was quieter than I expected. Almost peaceful, like the building had taken a breath along with the rest of the city. A young officer at the desk looked up and asked if I needed help. I told him my name. He checked something on his screen, then stood and motioned for me to follow him. We walked down a hallway that smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. At the end of it stood Detective Briggs. He looked exactly as I remembered from that seminar. A little older, maybe. Hair fading to gray at the temples, eyes steady and patient. He extended his hand and thanked me for coming in tonight. His voice was calm, in that way that makes you feel like the ground under you might still hold. He led me to a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a box of tissues that made my throat tighten even though I had not cried since leaving the house. I set the folder on the table. He hasn't touched it yet. He just looked at me first, like he was trying to see how much of me was afraid and how much was resolved. I told him everything. Not all at once, not in a rush, just piece by piece, like laying down cards in a game I never wanted to play. The accounts with mismatched numbers, the forged signatures on my trust fund, the emails hint at shifts in ownership, missing client money, my slow exclusion from the firm, the emergency meeting scheduled right after Christmas, the plan to rewrite my future without telling me I was no longer part of it. He asked questions with careful pauses. Who approved these transfers? Did I have direct access? When did I first notice something wrong? Who else might know? Has anyone warned me to stay quiet? Has anyone threatened me? I answered, as honestly as I could, even when the truth tasted bitter, even when saying my dad's actions out loud made the room feel smaller. When he finally opened the folder and started flipping through the documents, I watched his expression change. Not dramatically, just small shifts. A frown, a breath through his nose, a quiet sigh when he saw a letter dated 3 years back that clearly contradicted the numbers reported to the same client weeks later. He said that this was not minor, not a misunderstanding, not sloppy accounting. This was deliberate, structured, long-term. He said that the trust fund documents alone were enough to open a separate investigation. He asked if I understood the gravity of what I was about to set in motion. I told him yes, I did. I told him I had been carrying that weight for weeks. He asked if there was any chance I was wrong. I shook my head. After nearly an hour, he closed the folder gently and said he needed to make a few calls. He stepped out. I sat there, staring at the blank wall. My hands ached from gripping one another. My throat felt raw, even though I had barely raised my voice. When he returned, he said the unit would open an emergency file that night. He said a separate team would begin reviewing the evidence immediately. He asked if I had any backup copies. I nodded, told him I had digital scans with timestamps saved on an external drive at home. He said that was good. Necessary. Then he hesitated before saying something else. He told me that my choice to come forward now might protect a lot of people who did not even know they had been harmed yet. He said most cases like this never had anyone on the inside willing to speak. He said the courage to walk into a police station on Christmas Eve is something he would not forget. The words did not feel like praise. They felt like a kind of responsibility, heavier than I expected. Before I left, he asked me one last question. He asked if anyone at the firm might suspect I was cooperating with law enforcement. I thought of the door closing in my face, the way my dad had looked at me like a problem already solved. I thought of Lily sitting in my seat, smiling. I told him no. No one suspected anything at all. The cold outside hit me again when I stepped back into the night. Snow had stopped falling, but the sidewalks were glazed with ice. The drive home felt longer, slower. My headlights moved across empty streets like I was the only person awake in the whole city. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me twice, even though I had never done that before. I turned off the living room lights, but left the small ones on the Christmas tree. They looked softer now, like quiet little anchors holding the room together. I set the empty folder on the dining table and sat in the same chair where I had cried over that rejected pie. I thought I would feel relief, or fear, or something sharp. Instead, I felt exhausted, tired in a way that went deeper than the body. I made a cup of tea and wrapped both hands around it while I looked out the window at the faint glow over the city. Every apartment across the way seemed filled with some kind of warmth. Families moving around. People finishing dinner. Laughter echoed faintly when someone opened a balcony door. I wondered for a moment if any of them could imagine what I had just done. I wondered if I should tell anyone. Call a friend, send a text. But who would I even tell? Everyone who should have stood beside me tonight had chosen to look away. So I drank my tea, changed into pajamas, and crawled under the blankets with my mind humming. I replayed every detail of the night. Every sentence in that little room, every quiet breath between questions. I must have drifted to sleep at some point. When I woke, it was the faint vibration of my phone on the nightstand. I reached for it in the dark. One text, from an unknown number. It said they knew someone had spoken. It said things would not end quietly for anyone involved. And we will find out who betrayed us. I stared at the screen as the Christmas morning light began to seep slowly through my blinds. For a few seconds, my brain could not quite connect the date, the message, and the reality of what I had done. My apartment was quiet. The only sound was the heating unit kicking on and off and a car sliding carefully down the icy street outside. My heart was pounding so loudly it almost drowned everything else out. They would find out who betrayed us. The words did not have a name attached, but I knew exactly whose thoughts they carried. That was the language of my dad's world. Betrayal. Loyalty. Us and them. I lay there with my phone in my hand and felt a wave of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. For a few minutes, I did nothing. I simply breathed and watched the gray light grow stronger. Somewhere across the river, children were probably waking up, running downstairs to stockings and presents. Kitchens were filled with the smell of cinnamon and coffee, Christmas music playing in the background, the picture of a holiday I had once thought was the only kind that mattered. My phone vibrated again, almost making me drop it. This time, it was a call. Detective Briggs? I answered before the first ring had fully finished. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency. He told me that a judge had reviewed the file overnight and signed them. Warrants, he said his team and some federal agents were assembling and would be serving papers at my dad's house and at the office within hours. He asked if I was safe. He asked if anyone had contacted me. I told him about the anonymous message. I could hear his breathing change when I read the words to him. He said I should screenshot it and forward it to him. He said not to respond. Then he told me something else. He said that once they showed up at the house, my name would eventually come out, but that by then it would be backed by official action, and not just suspicion. When we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the floor. It struck me that this was how my family's Christmas morning was beginning, with agents getting ready to knock on their door, not neighbors dropping off cookies. I moved through my apartment on autopilot. Shower, jeans and a sweater, hair pulled back. I made coffee but barely tasted it. My hands shook less than I expected when I gathered what I needed. My external drive. A printed list of clients I knew had been harmed. The same tote bag I always used for work. An old habit pretending this was just another work day. Around 8 in the morning, my phone buzzed again, this time with a text from a number I did recognize. A neighbor from my parents' street. She and my mom had served on the same charity board for years. Her message was short and full of the kind of stunned energy that practically vibrates through the words. She said there were police cars all up and down the block. She said something serious was happening at the Hollander house. I did not even remember deciding to go. 1 minute, I was standing in my kitchen. The next minute, I was locking the front door behind me and crunching across the frozen sidewalk toward my car. The air slapped my face as I slid behind the wheel. The engine protested at first, then settled into a low growl. My breath left pale clouds on the windshield while I waited for the defroster to catch up. The drive across town felt both too fast and agonizingly slow. Every red light felt personal. When I turned onto my parents' street, my chest tightened so hard I had to remind myself to breathe. The scene in front of the house did not look real. It looked like something from a news segment. Several dark sedans and what had to be at least 3 marked police cars lined the curb in front of the brownstone. Flashing lights strobed red and blue across the snow, turning the white drifts into shifting colors. Yellow tape had been stretched across part of the walkway. Neighbors were out in coats over pajamas, boots hastily shoved on, some holding coffee mugs that steamed in the cold air. They stood in small clusters on the sidewalk, talking in hushed, excited tones. A few of them glanced at me as I parked farther down the block. I saw a flicker of recognition in one woman's face. Then she looked away quickly, as if unsure which side of this story I belonged on. I got out of the car and closed the door gently. My legs felt strangely light as I walked toward the house. I stayed behind the loose line of onlookers at first, not wanting to draw attention. But my eyes were pulled to the open front door. Agents in dark jackets moved in and out. One carried a cardboard box, already half full of file folders. Another had a laptop tucked under his arm. A third was speaking with someone just inside the threshold, blocking my view. Then I saw my mom. She stood just inside the hallway, one hand on the edge of the console table, where she always kept fresh flowers. Today there were no flowers, only a bowl for keys and a crystal dish she used for minutes. Her face looked paler than I had ever seen it. The careful makeup she had probably applied that morning was already smudged near her eyes. She was talking to an officer who appeared to be explaining something, his hands moving gently in the air. Her head moved in small jerks, as if she were nodding but not truly hearing. After a few minutes, she turned her head and glanced past him toward the street. For a second, our eyes met. It was a small moment, a tiny line between us across the cold air and the cluster of people, but it felt like someone had pressed pause on the whole scene. I could not read her expression. Confusion. Maybe an accusation? Maybe a flicker of something else, something like realization. Before I could even raise a hand, she looked away. A sharp voice cut through the noise, and my gaze snapped back to the doorway. Savannah appeared, hair a little messier than usual, wearing what looked like yesterday's dress with a cardigan thrown over it. She was angry. It came off her in waves. She was speaking to a man in a suit, who had to be one of the lead agents. She gestured at the street, at the cars, at the neighbors. I did not need to hear the words to know she was talking about reputation and misunderstanding and damage that could not be undone. Then my dad stepped into view. He was not wearing the polished sweater from the night before. He wore a shirt with the sleeves rolled up and no tie. His jaw was clenched, his eyes hard and sharp. 2 agents stood slightly behind him. watching. I saw one of them show him a set of papers. I recognized the shape of a warrant, even from a distance. My dad skimmed it with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. He shook his head once in that tight, dismissive way I knew so well, the same motion he used when a deal did not go his way. He said something to them, his mouth moving in short, controlled lines. One of the agents replied. There was no shout, just a grim firmness that said the conversation was no longer in my dad's control. It happened slowly, and then, all at once. They indicated that he needed to come with them. He straightened his shoulders as if preparing for a photo instead of what was happening. When one of the officers stepped closer with handcuffs, the crowd of neighbors stirred. I heard a quick intake of breath from someone to my left. A man further down the sidewalk muttered something under his breath. Savannah reacted first. She moved to stand between my dad and the officers, her hands spread wide. I could see the shape of the word no on her lips. She said that this was a mistake, that they were humiliating an innocent man, that this was some kind of political move or jealous rivals doing. She pointed in the vague direction of downtown, toward the cluster of other firms and competing funds. The officers did not move. One of them reached gently for her elbow and guided her a step to the side. My dad said something then, too quiet for me to hear, but whatever it was, made the agent's expression sharpen. The handcuffs clicked around my dad's wrists. The sound carried down the walkway like a tiny hammer blow. Only then did my dad look out toward the street. His gaze moved over the parked cars, the cluster of neighbors, the holiday wreaths on nearby houses. And then he saw me. For a heartbeat, his expression went blank. Then it hardened into something I had never seen directed at me before, a mix of rage and betrayal and contempt. He straightened as much as the cuffs would allow and said something in my direction. I could not quite catch every word over the noise, but I knew the shape of them. He called me disloyal. He said I had chosen enemies over blood. He said I would regret this for the rest of my life. I did not step back. My fingers curled into my palms so tightly that my nails dug crescents into me. Skin. I held his gaze. I did not yell. I did not apologize. Inside my head, I thought of Helen, of the other clients whose names were on that list in my bag, of the forged signature that had turned my own future into a withdrawal line on a balance sheet. If there was any regret in me at that moment, it was not for what I had done. It was for all the time I had spent believing there was a version of this story where he chose me over his schemes. Movement near the doorway caught my eye again. Lily stood half behind Savannah, her face drained of color. She was wrapped in a robe that was pulled tight at the neck, her hair pulled up in a messy knot. She looked small, more like a scared child than the ambitious professional who had always walked the office halls with her head high. Our eyes met. For a second, the noise and the flashing lights and the cold all faded, and it was just the two of us, the history of our friendship hanging between us like a thread that had finally snapped. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again when an officer gestured for her to step back inside. My mom had sunk down onto the bottom stair just inside the entryway. Someone had brought her a glass of water. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. She kept looking between my dad and the agents, as if trying to reconcile the man being led toward the car with the image she had held on to for decades. Another car door opened. My dad was guided toward it. The handcuffs gleamed briefly in the winter light. He kept his eyes on me as long as he could, before the car frame cut off his line of sight. The door shut with a solid, final sound. For a moment, it felt like the whole street held its breath. Then the world started moving again. Neighbors began talking quietly, casting glances toward the house and then toward me. One of them, a woman who had known my mom since we were children, walked over and rested a hand lightly on my arm. She did not ask what happened. She just said softly that it was going to be a hard day for everyone and that I should take care of myself. I nodded, more out of reflex than understanding. As the patrol cars began to pull away, their lights still flashing but sirens off, I stepped back from the loose circle of onlookers. The cold finally seeped through the adrenaline, making my fingers sting. I realized my phone was still in my hand, buzzing gently in my palm with incoming messages from numbers I half recognized. I took one last look at the house, at the open door, at my mom sitting on the stairs. At Savannah, talking angrily into her phone. Lily disappears deeper into the hallway. Then I turned and walked back toward my car, the snow crunching under my boots, my breath floating in small white clouds in the air in front of me. I sat in my car with both hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead as if the street might steady itself if I did not move. My breath fogged the windshield until I finally turned the defroster on. The heat filled the cabin slowly, warming my face. But my hands still felt cold from something deeper than the winter air. I could still see the flashing lights flickering against the snow in my rearview mirror. For a long moment, I did not start the engine. I just sat there and let the stillness settle over me the way dust settles after a collapse. When I finally pulled away from the curb, I felt every muscle in my body tighten. I drove carefully down the street, past neighbors still gathered in clumps, some whispering to each other, some watching me with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. I did not meet their eyes. I could not. The shame was not mine, but it still clung to the edges of this morning like frost on the windows. Traffic was light as I reached the main road. Most people were still inside their homes, wrapped in holiday routines. I stopped at a red light and suddenly realized I had no idea where I was going. Home felt too small, too quiet, too full of the echoes of last night. So I drove without a plan until I found myself near the Charles River. I parked near the path and stepped out, pulling my coat tighter around me as the wind cut along the water. I walked slowly, one foot crunching into snow, then the next. My thoughts drifted like the thin ice forming at the edges of the river. I thought about my dad sitting in the back of that police car, his wrists cuffed, his eyes locked on mine with a hatred so sharp it had almost made my knees buckle. I thought about my mom on the stairs, looking like a woman who had lost something she was not ready to name. I thought about Savannah arguing with the lead agent, her voice rising in that familiar mix of privilege and panic. And I thought about Lily standing small and pale in the entryway, the spark she once had dimmed under the weight of what had just unfolded. I stopped near the railing and leaned against it, breathing fog into the cold morning air. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated. What I felt was complicated and heavy and unfamiliar. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the hardest part was not the fall, but knowing you had chosen to step forward. My phone buzzed again. I hesitated before pulling it from my pocket. A new message from an unknown number. My stomach dropped, but I opened it anyway. It was only 4 words. "We know it was you." This time, I did not freeze. I took a slow breath and blocked the number. Then I forwarded it to Detective Briggs with a note saying it had come in only minutes before. I kept walking along the river until my toes were numb. A jogger passed me, breath visible, dogs trotting at her side, completely unaware of the storm unraveling in my world. Watching her move reminded me that the rest of the city was still turning, still waking, still living. My life had narrowed into one sharp, painful point, but everyone else was stirring eggs and opening presents and calling relatives. I stood there, letting that truth sink into my bones. It did not make anything easier, but it made the moment feel less suffocating. By late morning, I forced myself back to my car. I drove home slowly, the streets now dotted with people carrying bags, kids in bright scarves, couples laughing. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, letting the quiet wrap around me. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, my hands finally steady. I sat at my table with the glass in front of me and looked at the folder, lying open from last night. The papers inside seemed older somehow, like relics from another life. But they were the reason all of this was happening, the reason I could finally breathe without pretending. A sharp knock startled me. I set the glass down and wiped my palms on my jeans. My footsteps sounded too loud on the hardwood floor as I approached the door. I peeked through the peephole. It was Detective Briggs. I opened the door quick enough that he did not have time to knock again. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He told me he was following up personally because he wanted me to hear certain information from him directly. He apologized for coming without calling first, but things were moving quickly. We sat at my table. He told me my dad had been taken into custody for questioning and that the warrants had led to enough evidence to begin formal charges. He said the office search had revealed discrepancies far deeper than what I had brought them. Multiple years of manipulated reports, client accounts that had been quietly drained, communications between senior staff suggesting coordinated concealment. He said it confirmed the pattern I had identified, but also widened the scope. A lot of people would be named and questioned. I listened quietly, my fingertips brushing the rim of my glass. When he paused, I asked the question that had been sitting heavy in my chest since dawn. Was my mom implicated? His voice softened. He said there was no indication so far that she had known anything about these financial operations. Her involvement appeared social, not professional. The air left my lungs in a shaky breath. For the first time that day, I felt something loosen in my chest. But it only lasted a moment, because then he said, my sister was another story. He said Savannah's email exchanges contained references to adjusting numbers and coordinating messaging with outside advisors. She would be questioned soon. I nodded, even though the words hit hard. Some part of me had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made the weight of it settle differently. Then he mentioned Lily. He said her name appeared in several places, suggesting she had been aware of structural inconsistencies even before I was. He said her role might be more complicated and would need further review. My jaw tightened at her name, but I said nothing. He looked at me for a long moment before asking how I was holding up. The question nearly broke me. I swallowed hard, told him I was fine, even though my voice betrayed me. He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. Before he left, he told me to stay reachable. He said there would be more questions, more updates, more unfolding pieces. He said my cooperation had already made an enormous difference, not just legally, but for the people who had been hurt quietly for years. After he walked out and the door clicked shut, the apartment felt colder again. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob for a long time, listening to the silence settle around me. Then I walked back to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the small Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner. This was not the holiday I thought I would have. Not even close. But somewhere beneath all the fear and grief was a small flicker of something steadier. Something like truth. Something like the first fragile shape of freedom. I sat there until the shadows shifted and the lights on the tree blurred slightly. Then my phone buzzed again. A name lit up the screen. It was Savannah. She was calling me. I sat there staring at the screen while the small Christmas tree in the corner blinked steadily, completely unaware that my entire family was cracking apart. For a moment, I thought about letting the call go to voicemail. I thought about pretending I did not see it, about choosing silence for one more minute. But something in me knew this had to happen, that the story could not end without this conversation. I answered. Her voice came through sharp and raw, as if she had been crying, but refused to let herself sound weak. She demanded to know if I was happy, if this was what I wanted, if destroying our dad's name on Christmas morning was worth whatever grudges I had been carrying. She told me the house was chaotic, that Mom had barely spoken since the officers left, that Lily was hysterical, and that everything was falling apart. I let her spill it out until she finally had to take a breath. When I spoke, I kept my voice level. I told her I did not destroy anything. I told her the wreckage had been built long before I ever picked up the phone. I told her that pretending everything was fine would not make the truth any less real. For a moment, she went silent on the other end. Then she asked how I could do this to our family. She said that people were already calling, investors panicking, reporters circling. She said I could have come to them quietly. I could have shown loyalty. I did not raise my voice. I did not let her drag me into the old patterns. I told her loyalty without integrity is nothing but fear with a nicer outfit. I told her I had been loyal my entire life. I told her I had stayed quiet when I should have asked questions, defended behavior I should have challenged, and protected people who never protected me back. I told her the only betrayal here was the one they committed against the people who trusted them, and against me when they shut the door in my face and thought that was the end of the story. Savannah let out a sound I could not interpret, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She said I had no idea what I had unleashed. She said I should pray that the investigators found enough evidence to put all the blame on Dad, because if the trail led to her desk, her email, her decisions, she would never forgive me. Not now, Not ever. The words did not land the way she meant them to. They drifted over me like cold air, uncomfortable but not piercing. I told her she made her own decisions. I told her she typed her own emails. I told her she had been old enough to choose right from wrong long before either of us entered the family business. And then I told her something that surprised even me. I told her I loved her. I told her I always had, and that was why it hurt so much to see her follow our dad's path when she had been the one person I believed might break free of it. She hung up without saying goodbye. The line went dead in my hand. I let the phone slide onto the cushion next to me and leaned back against the couch. I stared at the ceiling, at the faint reflection of the Christmas light, and tried to understand what kind of ending I was standing inside of. I spent the rest of the day in a strange kind of quiet. I cleaned the kitchen without thinking. I warmed a bowl of soup I barely tasted. I walked from room to room like the apartment was a place I had just moved into. Every now and then my phone buzzed with new messages I did not open. I needed a pause from everyone else's panic. Late in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door. For a second, my heart jumped. But when I opened it, it was my cousin Hannah, bundled in a thick coat with snow dusting her shoulders. She said she had been trying to reach me and decided to come over when I did, not reply. She stepped inside, took one look at my face, and pulled me into a hug without asking permission. It was the first time all day someone had touched me without anger or fear attached. We sat at the table with mugs of hot tea between us. Hannah told me she had heard from a friend at the courthouse that the investigation would expand quickly. The evidence seized at both the house and the firm had already been flagged as significant. She said my testimony would likely be required in the next few days. Then she looked at me, her expression soft, and asked if I was sure I was doing all right. That question opened something inside me. I told her the truth, that I felt relieved and guilty and exhausted and strangely calm, that I worried about Mom, that I did not know if I would ever have a relationship with Savannah again, that I did not hate my dad, but I could no longer mourn the loss of someone who had never really existed the way I once believed. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug, her eyes kind in that way only someone who has loved you your whole life can manage. When she left, evening had fallen. The apartment was dim, except for the lights on the tree. I stood near the window watching the tiny flakes drift under the street lamp. There was a peacefulness settling over the neighborhood, a kind of hush that only happens on Christmas night. I thought about the year ahead, about the hearings and the statements, and the inevitable headlines. I thought about my mom, alone in that house with every illusion shattered. I thought about Savannah and whether she would ever see any of this clearly. I even thought about Lily and wondered what she was telling herself to get through the night. Then I thought about myself, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel small. I did not feel broken. I felt steady, grounded, certain. I walked to the tree and turned it off, letting the room fall into a soft darkness. I sat on the couch and let the quiet wrap around me. It felt like the end of something, but also the beginning of something much more honest. Before I went to bed, I opened my laptop and typed a message to Detective Briggs, confirming I was available for whatever next steps were required. After I hit send, I closed the computer gently and stood there for a moment with my hand resting on the lid. It felt symbolic in a way I could not explain, like closing one chapter of my life before stepping into another. I turned off the last of the lights and walked to my bedroom. I paused at the doorway, looking back at the darkened apartment, and felt a quiet sense of pride in the space I had built with my own hands, my own paycheck, my own choices. No borrowed reputation, no family shadow, just me. And in that stillness, in that last moment of Christmas night, I understood something deeply, that sometimes the loudest act of love you can give yourself is the willingness to walk away from people who use your loyalty as a leash. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you're listening from.